could it? The possibility intrigues Professor Barry Gibb of Liverpool University's Audio Research Department. Assisted by colleague Gary Seifert, he is exploring the physical impact of sound on solid objects.
Sound can destroy structures if you take as the premise that sound is a pressure is a force, and that any force, if it's big enough, will move a body. Resetting on linear. Okay. Happy. Go.
Gibb and Seifert are currently conducting experiments to understand the exact science behind the phenomenon.
What I'm doing here is to put some powder into the funnel. The idea of this simple experiment is to see if sound energy alone can cause the powder to flow.
The experiment uses a fine powder, gypsum, in the belief that if sound can move a powder, it may affect a solid object too. The required level and pitch of sound is produced by a giant horn, situated in the adjoining room. The two scientists sit at a remote monitoring station. The experiment begins.
Reset for linear.
Yeah. Happy with the shot?
Yeah.
Okay.
When the horn is off, the powder sits in the funnel. When it is on, something remarkable happens. The powder flows like a fluid. Why this happens is still a mystery, but Professor Gibb believes sound waves break the bonds between the powder particles. The effect is dramatic and opens up the possibility that a solid object may also be affected.
This is a brick similar to the ones that would have been used to construct the walls of Jericho, and we intend now to replace the powder with the brick and repeat the test. Happy? Go.
The experiment begins again. If the brick disintegrates, it will go a long way to explaining what made Jericho's walls fall down. The sound levels produced in this test chamber are significantly higher than Joshua's trumpets. If the brick does not respond here, it's unlikely to have been damaged at Jericho.
Well, the brick is unaffected by the sound in this preliminary experiment. Also, the surface particles seem to be unmoved. From it, I would have to say that the walls of Jericho may well have fallen down, but it wasn't sound that did it.
Of course, the fact that the brick was unaffected in these tests doesn't mean Jericho's walls didn't crumble, or indeed the city wasn't ransacked and set on fire. Far from it, as Garstang's excavations in the 1930s revealed.
The walls that Garstang thought were associated with Joshua's conquest had very clear signs of damage and destruction. And you can see this in some of his photographs.
Archaeology also supports another of the Bible's claims, that Jericho had been set alight.
Probably the most sensational thing he found was a wholesale destruction by fire of the city walls and the city gates and the shops and residences inside. Really quite dramatic evidence for a destruction.
It's now clear the sound of trumpets alone could not have caused that devastation. Yet many of the facts do fit. The archaeological record seems remarkably consistent with Jericho's fate as described in the Bible. But if trumpets didn't bring Jericho's walls tumbling down, what did? Perhaps there's a clue earlier in the story. According to the Bible, when Israelite priests leading Joshua's army reached the River Jordan, something incredible happened. The water level dropped. The priests led the way across dry land. It's a miraculous moment, but not the only time it happened. The Jordan also stopped flowing in July 1927, and these photographs from the time tell us why. The Jordan Valley suffered an earthquake, causing landslides that dammed the river for 2 days, just like the story suggests. What's more, seismologists now believe an earthquake could also have been responsible for Jericho's destruction. Exactly why becomes clearer at the Seismological Institute of Israel. Here, computers record the output of sensors across Israel, the West Bank and Jordan. They monitor a major fault running the length of the Jordan Valley, a fault that caused minor fractures, one of which runs right under the east wall of ancient Jericho, making it extremely vulnerable to seismic activity. And there is archaeological evidence suggesting earthquakes did indeed strike the city. Not once, but many times, as archaeologist John Garstang discovered.
Jericho was subjected more than once to significant earthquakes. In the early levels, he found very, very distinctive cracks that split earlier burials. Here you can see the crack has severed the head of this individual here.
But if the damage to Jericho's walls was caused not by sound but by an earthquake, where does that leave Joshua and his advancing army? Perhaps the earthquake conveniently struck Jericho at the same time as the Israelites attacked the city. Remarkably, that's just what Garstang's evidence suggested.
Garstang found evidence of earthquake damage in the walls that he associated with the Joshua conquest. Very, very clear evidence of earthquake damage, tumbles of bricks, repatching, and general disarray of masonry.
With the addition of earthquakes to the story, Garstang's discoveries seem to confirm almost all details of the Bible writer's account. It seems that Joshua did conquer Canaan, just like the story says. But there's a problem. In the 1950s, another British archaeologist followed Garstang to Jericho, and that's when all the trouble began. That archaeologist was the renowned expert Kathleen Kenyon. She became interested in Jericho when John Garstang asked her to re-examine his findings. In 1952, Kenyon began her own epic excavation.
Kathleen Kenyon was able to examine in minute detail the very, very complex phases of occupation at Jericho. She was able to see an awful lot that Garstang had simply missed.
What Garstang missed was crucial evidence contradicting his date for Jericho's destruction. Rather than the walls collapsing in 1400 BC, as Garstang believed, Kenyon concluded they had finally fallen 150 years before, in 1550 BC. If she was right, Jericho had been ruined long before Joshua could have left Egypt. An earthquake may have destroyed its walls, but it didn't coincide with Joshua's attack as Garstang originally supposed. And that's not the only problem facing the traditional version of Joshua's heroic conquest. If the Israelites did reach Jericho at the traditional date of 1400 BC, Kenyon's excavations revealed that the city they found would have looked very different to the one described in the Bible.
The defences had fallen into disuse. It was effectively undefended. Very little population there. It wouldn't have been much of a conquest, to be honest.
But if a battle for Jericho was unnecessary, it does beg the question why the Israelites' arrival is described as a conquest at all. Well, the Bible says Joshua's invasion didn't just involve Jericho.